Hey, good evening, and welcome to Domination Submission Radio. My name is Mike Makai, and I am your host with the most BDSM, kink, and fetish talk on Blog Talk Radio. This is a call-in show, so if you have a mind to call in and tell us what you think, or ask a question, or just vent, then you can go ahead and do that by calling us at 347-857-1862. Let me give you that number one more time. You ought to write it down. You're going to call me sooner or later. 347-857-1862. We also have a chat room. If you prefer to ask your questions or make your opinions known in the chat room, then just scroll to the bottom of the screen. If you're listening to us live on Blog Talk Radio, and you should see it there. If you're logged in to a free account at Blog Talk Radio, then you can actually type in the chat room, and everything should work just fine for you. We do have a website. The website address is domination-submission.com, domination-submission.com, and that's also where you can find our links to Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and all of the other social media, which we'd love to have you follow us on. I do have a co-host in the virtual studio with me this evening, and that co-host is a primal, switchy masochist and Amazon redhead, better known as Little Red. How you doing, Little Red?
I am. Oh, Betsy, I got to lay off the Starbucks before we start doing these shows. I really do. Oh, my God.
I forgot to call you Too Much Coffee Girl also.
It is never such a thing.
We are going to be talking tonight about fakes, phonies, and posers. I just kind of like the sound of that, fakes, phonies, and posers. It's a topic that's almost guaranteed to rub some people the wrong way. So I hope we don't insult or offend anyone this evening. We're going to try very hard not to. But this is also a topic that a lot of people are concerned about. Wouldn't you say, Red?
Well, yeah, especially with the prevalence of the online communities we have now, like FetLife and Color Me and things like that. So this is a very big thing.
Mm-hmm. I think it is, and it's also an important thing in the sense that anyone who's fairly new to the lifestyle, who gets mixed up with somebody who's not who or what they purport themselves to be, can be damaged, both physically, emotionally, mentally, in a lot of different ways by that interaction with somebody who is not necessarily who or what they say they are. So I was reminded before the show, there's an old, very famous quote by Arthur C. Clarke, the author, who said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And somebody took that and changed it around a little bit, and they made it into another quote. And that quote is that any sufficiently advanced incompetence is indistinguishable from malice. And so sometimes people aren't necessarily trying to injure you or to harm you emotionally or make your life miserable, but they're just so incompetent that the end result, the consequences, are indistinguishable from somebody who actually is out to hurt you. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about that this evening. I think that there's a lot of damage that can be done to people, and not just submissives. I mean, there's a lot of damage that can be done to dominance by a phony submissive, and there's a lot of damage that can be done to submissives by phony dominance. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. What do you think, Red?
I think we're going to have a full show.
I do too. If we're lucky, we're going to have a guest in the second half, which will be very interesting, and we'll cover a facet of this discussion which neither you nor I are very well versed in. So I think that's going to be interesting as well. So let's start the discussion, Red, with a question. And my question to you is this: why do we hear so much about phony doms, a little bit less about phony subs, but we never hear anything about a phony switch? Why do you think that is?
I'm trying to think of the PC way to put it, because I really don't want to offend anybody.
I really do need to get cricket sound effects, don't I? I keep saying I'm going to do that.
Well, it's not that. I'm trying to be more politically correct so that way I really don't truly offend people, because I really don't want to. You hear more prevalently about the phony doms because you come across so many of them. Honestly, I've come across I don't know how many in my experience in the kink community, and, you know, they think they're the dommiest dom who ever dommed on the face of the planet. And it's honestly funny to me, and it's funny as all get out to me, because they are so utterly clueless when they actually come across someone who has done this for years. And they are so utterly clueless when we're sitting there laughing at them, because we're doing it in such a way that they don't realize we're laughing at them. they think we're just amusing and, it's cute, and we're generally laughing at them because they have no idea we know what they are. And it's easy to spot those ones. To find a sub that is a phony, I haven't really come across too many of those because subs are subs. I mean, you can spot a submissive at IHOP, waitressing, or cashiering, or even a CEO at a high-ranking corporation. You can spot a sub a mile away. Those are easy to pick out of a crowd.
I'm going to disagree with you just a little bit here, not in any really big or hard way, but yeah, you can spot someone who is predisposed to be submissive a mile away. At least I can. I have all my life. And that has a lot to do with the fact that this is the dynamic that I have always been attracted to my entire life. And so I can spot a submissive from across a crowded room the way a gay person can spot another gay person from across the room. It's just that radar that every one of us gets that allows us to seek out people that we're attracted to, obviously. But on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily mean that the person who has this predisposition to be dominant or submissive, or switch for that matter, is skilled at it. And this is, I think, where a lot of the miscommunication, a lot of the mislabeling occurs, because what happens is you meet somebody or you run across somebody, whether it's online or in the real world, and they demonstrate a tendency or predisposition to be dominant or submissive or whatever the case may be. And you assume that makes them a dominant or submissive or whatever. And unfortunately, there are skills that have to kind of go along with it, just like there are relationship skills in any typical vanilla monogamous relationship. There are skills that make it easier or harder on the people in that relationship. And when you are a vanilla person married to somebody who has no communication skills, who has no relationship skills, who has hasn't learned courtesy, all those little things that grease the wheels of a good relationship, whether it be vanilla or kink related, if those things aren't there, then the relationship fails. Well, when it happens out there in the vanilla world, we tend to say, well, okay, it just didn't work out, and we move on. Well, unfortunately, when we come to the kink community, when we look at DS relationships and BDSM relationships, you see this bad tendency to label someone who has incompetent relationship skills as being a phony. You've seen this, right, Red? Don't tell me you haven't seen this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And people will say, well, he's a... and in fact, when the breakup happens, these people go around telling everyone, well, don't get involved with that guy because he's a phony. And then you ask, well, why is he a phony? And the answers that you get to that question never cease to amaze me, because they usually end up being something like, well, he's a phony because he doesn't know that I'm supposed to do this, or he's supposed to give me rules, or I'm supposed to, he doesn't understand that, I need to be punished whenever he doesn't understand that I'm just being a brat, or whatever the reason is. But what it really boils down to is that most of the time, it simply means that their dynamic isn't working for some reason. Maybe they're two different, maybe it's a certain type of a dominant and a certain type of a submissive who just don't go together.
Yeah.
So, and there are lots of different ways you can mismatch a dominant with a submissive. Does that mean either one of them is a phony dominant or a phony submissive? No, it just means that they lack either the proper dynamic between the dom and sub, or they lack the necessary skills to make the relationship work, or any number of things. I mean, one of the problems I've encountered many times, in fact, and you'd think I would learn, but no, is people who mistake being a bottom for being a submissive. And the same thing with confusing being a top for being a dominant. Just because somebody knows how to swing a flogger or spank a bottom or tie somebody up, they assume that they're a dominant. And that's not necessarily true. That's a skill that anyone can learn. Vanilla, dominant, submissive, top, bottom. It's a skill anyone can learn. It doesn't make them a dominant. The dominant or submissive is defined by the dynamic that exists between the partners in the relationship. And it has nothing to do with what you're doing Saturday night at the play party. Do you agree with me there?
I do absolutely agree with that, because I can bottom or I can top. I can go both ways on that. I prefer to submit to one, and we're all well aware of that. But it's the dynamic you create, because I know several tops, I know several doms that can bottom to experience something. They can do that to bottom. And it doesn't make them any less of a dom to bottom and experience something for themselves that way than it would be for, you know, a submissive to top and get the experience to swing the flogger or be the domestic top where they're putting the rules out for the house. It's how you want it to be. It doesn't. The labels don't necessarily matter. It matters your dynamic.
Right. Yeah, I do believe that a lot of these cases where somebody is mislabeled as a phony submissive or a phony dominant really just boil down to miscommunication or a bad relationship dynamic or people who are unskilled at relating to each other. But I also think sometimes it boils down to a self-centered, kind of an egocentric universe where people expect to get something out of this arrangement, whatever the arrangement is, and when they don't get it, then the other person is a phony. And by that I mean, let's say, for example, that let's say you are a hardcore masochist, and you go into the lifestyle believing that the dominant exists to cater to your masochism. And if you go into a relationship with that preconception, and when you hook up with a dominant who is not a hardcore sadist, like myself, for example, I'm not a hardcore sadist. I mean, I'm skilled in those arts, but I don't get a whole lot of jollies out of it. I think it's really easy to fall into the trap of saying, well, okay, I'm a masochist, he's not satisfying my masochistic urges, therefore he's a phony. Do you ever see that happen, Red?
Yeah, and that's mismatching, honest to God, because, you know, you should have a clear understanding of the partner you're getting involved with, whether it's just for play or it's more serious than that and you're becoming actual partners rather than play partners. Because I could not have that dynamic where I don't have a sadist to feed my masochist side, you know, who doesn't spank me, doesn't flog me, things like that. I couldn't do it, and it would end up deteriorating rapidly.
Sure. I think there's also kind of a third possibility that explains why some people become mislabeled as phonies and fakes, and I think that is, unfortunately, a function of people who are brand new, who are completely clueless themselves, who may have read 50 Shades of Grey, or maybe not even that knowledgeable about the lifestyle, who go in with a completely unrealistic perception or preconception of what the lifestyle is like, and they actually hook up with somebody who's real, but because they are comparing that real person against a mythical standard which doesn't really exist, suddenly that person gets labeled a phony. Ever seen that?
Yeah, I have actually experienced that.
Tell me about that.
And I was actually brand spanking new many moons ago. Didn't even know what this lifestyle was truly called. It just interested me. I didn't know a flogger from a dragon's tail or a whip. I didn't differentiate between them because I didn't know any difference. A whip is a whip is a whip. Well, that's not the case. I was at a dungeon play party with a friend of mine, and he was a older dom, brought me in because I was interested, and he said, hey, why don't you come to this party with me, check it out. And I think the word poser came about, and it wasn't received well by me at all, and I was no longer allowed in that dungeon. It did not go over well when I was like, yeah, sure, that sounds like fun. Not knowing what anything was, you know, I was just kind of watching and talking. And
so who got called a poser, you or the dominant?
I did.
You got called a poser.
Because I was sitting to the left of him, so they automatically assumed I was his submissive.
Then you were labeled a poser.
Because I was sitting to his left, and I didn't know how a submissive was supposed to act, and I answered questions when I was supposed to look to my dominant first, and blah, 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 and this is just a game to me. You know, kind of like the kids walking around in the mall with the collars on that they sell at Spencer's and Hot Topic.
Well, of course, you know, this can happen because, again, people will make assumptions without all of the facts or not be very knowledgeable about the lifestyle at all themselves. And so because reality or what they see in front of them doesn't match their preconceptions, then suddenly somebody's labeled a poser or a phony. And so, yeah, that does happen. And so I guess what we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about is how do we kind of avoid that, because I really do believe that the great majority of people who are labeled as posers or phonies or fakes really aren't. I believe that a lot of them are just still learning, or they have made some sort of a social blunder that kind of labels them that way, like you just told us about there, where you didn't even realize that you were making any mistakes because you were very new to the whole lifestyle, and all you were doing was sitting here trying to be friendly, and everyone thinks you're a poser. So I also think that a lot of people get labeled this way just because they haven't really thought about some of the things that we talk about in the lifestyle. So you ask them a question, they are totally unprepared for it, and the answer just sounds so unbelievable sometimes, or just so out there, that your immediate thought is, my God, this guy's a complete and total phony, which may not necessarily be the case. I mean, not all of us go home at night and think about a lot of these issues and come up with witty and coherent answers to all the questions that they might be asked. And so sometimes you get blindsided by that sort of thing. So yeah, it can be very frustrating. So how do we avoid putting that label on so many people, or having that label applied to ourselves? And I think there are a couple things that you can do, and we're going to talk about those in the next 10 minutes or so. I think first of all, you need to perform a brutal self-assessment of yourself, and talk about that in a second. I think you also need to take time to let things develop and settle out and get answers to certain questions that you can't always get in a first meeting, for example. I think you ought to be able to do an interview, and we'll discuss some of that too, and take into account some special considerations for things like online relationships which can develop. And then, if all else fails and if somebody does actually turn out to be a phony, we're going to talk a little bit about what do you do then, especially when you're in a tight-knit community, and a phony can do a lot of damage, and these people are your friends, and so what do you do? How do you handle that? So we'll take each of those in turn, but first we'll go with self-assessment. What do you think about that, Red? Do you think a brutal self-assessment can help eliminate a lot of these problems?
I do, but you have to understand the questions to ask yourself. Is it interesting? Yeah, I am interested in a lot because I haven't experienced all that the kink community has to offer, and there's no way that you can ever experience all of it, because it's just, in my opinion, it's not possible to experience all of the kinks. There's just not enough time, and there's not enough people in some of the communities, the smaller communities, to be able to learn to do this. You also need to ask yourself, at your core base, down to your pinky toe nail, how important is this to you? Is this something you have to have every day, or is this something that you only need, once a week, once a month, once a year, and on the scale of 1 to 10 in how it fits in your life? Because a lot of people will get into something and then realize this is truly not for me, and then they're neck deep in it and they don't know how to get out.
I find it curious, Red, that you immediately kind of zeroed in on the activities, like the bedroom activities, spankings, the BDSM activities that a lot of people typically associate with the lifestyle. Now, see, I do kind of the opposite. When I think about a self-assessment, the first thing I think about is, all right, am I really a dominant? Am I really submissive? Am I just a dominant at work but a submissive at home? How much did I contribute to the failures of my previous relationships? Why didn't those previous relationships work out? Was I too aggressive? Was I too passive? Was I too mean? All those different questions that come to mind, for me at least, are dynamic related. But it was I think it was interesting that the first thing that you jumped on was the kink activities.
That's the majority of what everybody sees first. They don't get the little subtle dynamic of the DS lifestyle. A lot of people get involved because they see something that is, in a movie or in a book or in, online in some porno, and they see those activities first and they go, ooh, I want to do that. They don't notice the subtle dynamic. How much power do I really want to give up? How much power do I want to take? How much responsibility do I want to give up and have for, the dom-sub, master-slave relationship? They see the activity first, and then the DF comes into it.
Right. See, and this is one of the things that I ask people sometimes when they tell me that they feel that they are destined for this lifestyle, particularly when they tell me that they think that they are submissive or they think that they are dominant, and normally they have fallen into the same pattern that you're discussing there, which is they're focusing almost entirely on the kink activities. And I almost always have to remind them that, there's more to the lifestyle than just BDSM. There's that DS dynamic. There's that relationship. And how deeply do you go into it? I mean, there's a certain point where, there's somebody sitting in front of me talking about, well, all they can think about is, whips and chains. And I'm thinking, okay, well, what about putting their kids through college? What about paying their bills? What about managing their budget? What about, mowing the lawn? Who does that? How does it happen? Who's in charge of that? And their mind is just boggled. They're going like, well, that doesn't have anything to do with anything. No, that's not true. I mean, if you are considering a DS lifestyle, and in my view, a lifestyle is defined by the fact that it impacts every facet of your life. Okay? If it's a Saturday night kink, guess what? It's not a lifestyle. A lifestyle means it affects your entire life. And so it does mean who's in charge of taking out the trash, who is in charge of the budget, who makes the decisions about what schools the kids go to, and all of that stuff. And so when you hear people say, well, is it possible to have more than one dominant? My answer to that is no. It just isn't. Now, you can have more than one top, definitely, because if all you're talking about is your bedroom activities or your kink or your Saturday night play parties, yeah, you can have as many doms as you want. But only one person gets to be in charge of what bills get paid this month. Only one person gets to be in charge of whether or not the kids go to college. You know what I'm saying? And so.
Oh yeah, because you're in charge of every facet of your life. I'm in charge of every facet of my life until my dom walks in the room, and then the decisions that I make are no longer mine. He makes those decisions. His household is his household, but mine is mine. But when we're together, he makes the decisions. I have a choice on where we want to go to eat. He'll give me, you want to go out for steak or Chinese tonight, But he's already made the decision down to he either wants steak or he wants Chinese food, and he's good with either one, and he's just asking me what my preference is that night.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the first things you have to do is do that self-assessment. You have to ask yourself, all right, what has gone wrong in my previous relationships? What makes me think that I want to be a dominant, or what makes me think that I am a submissive, or what makes me think that I'm a switch? And oh, by the way, I mentioned at the first part of the show, why do we never hear about phony switches? I'll tell you why I think we never hear about phony switches. I think we never hear about them because it has become, in the minds of many people, the default. If you're neither a dominant or submissive, then you must be a switch, okay? And so it becomes kind of a default setting. So if you're neither one of the two extremes, then you must be a switch. Well, I don't think so, because it takes a lot of skill and it takes a certain mindset to actually be a real switch. And, there are a lot of people who, for example, may be hardwired to be dominant or submissive, but don't even realize it because they haven't been in one of those relationships yet. And so they've played around, they've experimented with a lot of different skill sets, they've topped, they've bottomed, and they immediately think that makes me a switch. I don't buy into that delusion, and we can talk about that in another show possibly. But I do believe that there's a misconception that if you're not good at being a dom, you're not good at being a sub, then you must be a switch. And I don't think so. I think we do actually have a very technical term for those people who are neither dominant or submissive or a switch. Those people are called normal. All right? I mean, most people on this planet are able to draw on both a dominant side of their personality and a submissive side of their personality. They draw on those skills as needed, where needed, when needed, and that's normal. That's what normal people do. It's only when you can't do that that makes you a hardwired dominant or a hardwired submissive. I couldn't be submissive if you tied me up and pointed a gun at my head. I mean, I have literally been held up, had a gun pointed at my forehead, and told to get on my knees, and I said, no. And the guy looked at me and said, what do you mean, no? And I said, if you're going to shoot me standing up. He didn't know how to react to that. He turned around and ran out the back door is what he did. But the bottom line is, I mean, I could tell you for a fact that it would take a hell of a lot to get any kind of a submissive gesture out of me. Not because, I think that one way of life is superior to the other. It's just I'm just hardwired to be a certain way. And I think certain other, I know submissives, former submissives of mine, by the way, who would puke at the mere thought of having to tell me what to do. Literally. I'm not joking at all. It would make some people sick to their...
I know exactly what you're talking about.
And so,
but, I'm right there with you because you know me really well. Most of our listeners know me really well for the most part now. There's no way if somebody told me out of the blue, you're going to do this, I turn around and look at them and laugh.
Right.
Now, my dog tells me that you are going to, and it's an immediate reaction, and it's just him.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and that's what I mean. It's the relationship dynamic in your relationship, and it has nothing to do with what you do at work or how you act around the kids or around your friends or any of that other stuff. All of that is totally irrelevant. It's simply a function of your relationship dynamic with your partner. And so I think that is the cause of a lot of misunderstandings in the lifestyle. But again, going back to the self-assessment thing, I think you have to take a long, hard look at yourself and say, okay, what am I deep down? Where do I find my happy place? What is the relationship dynamic with the person I love? Not what I do at work, not what I do anywhere else. How do I express my love? And if that's as a submissive or as a dominant, well then, hey, more power to you. But I mean, you got to go into these things knowing up front. You can't go into them just vague on it and hope it'll all somehow sort itself out, because it really won't. Okay, so we are going to, when we come back from the break, we're going to talk a little bit more about how time is your friend. We're going to talk about interviewing questions, online considerations, and what to do in the community. And we do have a surprise guest that hopefully will be calling in very soon here. We'll talk about that aspect in a particular subculture of the lifestyle. So you're listening to Domination Submission Radio. My name is Mike Makai. My co-host is Little Red, and we will be back in about 2 minutes. And we are back. You're listening to DS Radio. We're talking about fakes, phonies, and posers this evening, and how that label may be applied erroneously to a lot of people for a lot of crazy reasons, how you can avoid having that label applied to you, and what do you do if you run across somebody who you are tempted to label as a fake, phony, or poser. So we went right up to the break talking about self-assessments and taking a long, hard look at yourself. One of the other things that you can do, I think, is recognizing that time is your best friend when it comes to the development of a stable DS relationship. And by that I mean that you shouldn't be in such a damn hurry to get hooked up with somebody in the lifestyle. And when you're submissive, we call that, what do we call it? Sub-frenzy, right? I don't know what you call it.
Yeah.
What do we call that when you're dominant, Red?
I call it Dom frenzy because, sub frenzy is you want to experience everything from the bottom, and you can't wait to experience all of it, and the Doms, you can't wait to do all of it to somebody. So I just call it Dom frenzy. That's mine.
Oh, okay. Well, the bottom line is don't be in such a damn hurry. Now, why do I say that? Well, one reason is because time has a way of exposing a lot of the little things that you don't pick up on with your first meeting or second meeting or even your third meeting sometimes. I think it also has a way of wearing down a person's phony facade. And by that I mean that I could pretend to be, Justin Bieber for 2 or 3 weeks, but after a while that gets really hard. And the facade has a way of simply becoming too hard to maintain after a while. And so time really does become your friend because it's really, really hard to maintain a phony front for any great length of time. Do you have any experience with someone who has tried to do that, Red?
Yeah, it was cute for a minute, and then he just couldn't keep it up anymore, and the facade cracked, and the truth came out real quick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
he was married and didn't divulge that, and didn't actually know what he was doing to the extent that I needed. And he did good for about a month, and then you could see little things started creeping up. 1 and 1 wasn't adding up to 2.
Right.
And
yeah, I had a good friend that did the same thing, and it was kind of an online. I won't call it a relationship, but an online friendship. She wanted it to be more than just a friendship, but I kept getting these yellow flags, and they were just tiny little things, but things like time zones that didn't add up, or for example, at one point she mentioned that she had been robbed and shot in the arm by a robber, but she was ready to go to work the next day. I'm like, I don't care how tough you are. Sylvester Stallone doesn't go back to work the next day after getting shot in the arm. Okay, so little things like
a paper pusher.
I
guess I can see that, but I would still like to lay on my couch and be pampered. That's just me, though.
But, after months and months, literally it was several months, of those little tiny things that just didn't add up, it became abundantly clear that this was an entirely fictional persona that this person had produced for everybody. And but you would never pick up on that if you had jumped into a relationship with somebody like that after the first week or two. It's only after several weeks, and actually in that case several months, that our circle of friends started picking up on all the little inconsistencies, and none of them by themselves labeled the person a phony. But when you take 20 of them, suddenly it all makes perfect sense. So time really is your friend when you are seriously considering getting involved with somebody. Now, what about interviews? How do you feel about interviews, Red? Do you think that interviews are something that have a lot of value in the lifestyle?
I do, just because, again, matching up that dynamic, once you find out and have a good base and grasp on where you want to go and who you are and what you want this to do, what you want to get out of it in the relationship, if you're going to take it to a relationship place, matching that up, asking the specific questions, over and over, honestly, because you can ask somebody on the first meeting, how do you feel about canes and crops and floggers? Or how do you feel about 24/7? How do you feel about master-slave versus dom-sub? You ask these questions, and then you can come back to them later, 4 or 5, 6 weeks later, or 3, 4 conversations later, and you could get an entirely different answer because they gave you the answers you were looking for at the time, trying to get that foot in the door kind of thing.
Sure.
And now they're in the door. Now they want to stay there, but they don't realize you remember that answer. It's also very important to pay attention to the answers, not just hear what you want to hear.
That's absolutely true. Now, are those the types of questions that you ask, Red? What questions do you like to ask when you are interviewing a potential partner?
I like to ask them, what are their likes, both vanilla and kink, because if we're actually going to be in a relationship, it's got to be more than just the kink. I want to go out to the movies and dinner. I want to go dancing and dinner. I want to go shoot pool, throw darts. There's things outside of the kink that I like to do, and I would like ours to match. We don't have to be 100% by any means, but be close, because there's activities you enjoy I may not enjoy because I don't know anything about them. And we go do those things, and I'm like, yeah, that's really not for me, but I'll go do them with you, but you're going to go dancing with me. You do that compromise, but you have to have a good foundation for it.
I think there are a lot of questions that I've heard people say there are no such things as stupid questions. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think there are some stupid questions, particularly when it comes to interviewing a potential DS relationship partner. There are lots of stupid questions that you can ask. And, I've put a few of them out, and I get some disagreement from people out there in the social media about it. But, for example, asking somebody, and I only say this because I get asked these questions all the time. If you don't think I get asked them 100 times a week by people, you're wrong. I do. And it's not that I am a potential partner for hundreds of people every week, but there are a lot of people who are kind of feeling me out and asking questions, trying to figure out what kind of a person I am in real life and that sort of thing. And so they'll ask questions which I don't even have to conduct an interview, because by the tone of the questions, by the content and context of the questions, it tells me pretty much all I need to know about that person. For example, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, what do you like to do? Which, is really a vague question right from the get-go, but it also leaves the door open for somebody literally to just kind of read off a list of things right out of 50 Shades of Grey or something. I like spanking, whipping, cropping, blah, 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 blah. And it tells you absolutely nothing about the person. It really doesn't. If anything, it might tell you that the person is a selfish ass, because he's focusing entirely on what he likes to do and has no real intention of ever getting around to what it is that you like to do. So, it really does, I think, qualify as a stupid question. Now, maybe it's something that you can ask much further down the road when you actually are going to be doing some of those things with this person. But I think it's probably a lot more important to find out if the person is compatible with you on a lot of other fronts, not just what kink activities that he likes to engage in. I think you also can be almost inherently asking a stupid question by asking a bunch of yes and no questions, which gives any moron the ability to take a 50-50 shot at whatever the answer is and know absolutely nothing about the topic. But, you're asking him a yes-no question. How wrong can he be at some point, So I think the key is to ask some open-ended questions that force him to actually reveal a little bit about what's going on in his head. Now, I see we have...
The limit question.
What's that?
Is my favorite. The limit question. What are your soft limits? What are your hard limits?
Sure.
That question, nobody, as long, you can read my profile and you can get an idea of what I am. But when I'm sitting there looking you in the eye and face-to-face, and I'm asking you what your soft limits are and what your hard limits are to see if they'll kind of be congruent with mine, you can't fake that. That is like the most awesome question ever. Everybody needs to ask that of their partners, in my opinion.
I think you're right. You can't fake an answer to that question, and particularly if you're asking that question of a dominant, that forces a dominant to do some real thinking. I've been doing this for 37 years. I hate to even say it. It's longer than most people who are listening or have been alive, probably. But I used to think I didn't have any limits. I really did. I was that naive at one time. And if you read my book, you have probably read the story of how one of my potential submissive partners literally pulled out a hammer and nails and asked me to drive nails through her nipples. And that's when I realized, you know what, I do have limits that I didn't even know existed up until this point. And so, yeah, I think it's a great question, and it does force people to think about it and express themselves in a way that tells you a lot about them. So now we do have a caller in the queue, and I'm going to bring her on just as a way of introducing her. Our caller's name is Roxy, and she is trained as a Kajira in the Gorean lifestyle. She doesn't consider herself an expert in gore, but she knows a hell of a lot more about it than I do, and a hell of a lot more about it than Red does, especially since Red's not a big fan. Are you, Red?
I, honest to God, know very little about it, except it's based off of the book. That's
mm-hmm.
And I know that from my understanding of it, the women are completely submissive, and I am man, hear me roar is kind of the general gist of it. I mean, I could be completely off base, and that's okay, but that's the kind of gist I got off of it, and I was like, yeah, no, I'll pass on that.
Yeah, well, we have brought a guest on who's going to tell us a little bit more about the Gorean way, but primarily she's going to tell us how do you spot a phony Gorean. So our guest is Roxana. So how are you doing, Roxana? Roxalana.
I am doing.
I'm just going to call you Roxy. Roxalana.
You can call me Roxy.
I'll call you
Roxalana. Roxalana it's actually a historical name. It was the name of the only harem slave who actually got freed and became the wife of a Turkish sultan. So there you go. That's the history behind my name. Not Gorean at all.
So now, tell us, Roxy, how do you spot a phony Gorean?
Oh, my goodness. It seems like we spend a lot of time on... It seems that there's a lot of energy spent in things Gorean, trying to out the other one as un-Gorean or try to prove yourself as more Gorean than the other. And it's kind of funny. I think you use this analogy in your book, and it's one that I used like a couple days ago before I got your book. It's, the Gore is based on a series of books by John Norman about a fictional planet called Gore. In there, yes, you're right, Red, that the men are dominant, the women are submissive. Slaves are, Kajira is a Gorean word for slave, and there's a lot of philosophy. John Norman, the Professor Lang, who is the person, John Norman's his pen name, Professor Lang is a professor of philosophy. So there's a lot of stuff about natural order, and that women are supposed to be submissive to men and men are supposed to be a certain way. So when you're talking about Gore, one of the things that you brought up in your book is I use the same analogy of the Trekkie and Trekker type thing. There's people who want to play it like it's almost like a role-playing game. Like it's like kinky World of Warcraft. And then there's people who actually get into the philosophy of it. And I tend to group more with the people who are in the philosophy of it and talk about, more of the context of the books and what it means and how to relate it to not a lifestyle like a kink. It's how Goreans want to live their life. To be true to yourself, to be honest, to be with honor, and as a Kajira or a slave, then a slave would basically, in a master-slave Gorean relationship, you were talking about boundaries and limits. Kajiras there are no limits, but I can explain that now if you want to, or at a later time. But the way that you spot a phony, though, one of the first things that you do is, what books have you read? You start asking them questions about the books. Mm-hmm. But there lies a trap with the books, because you get people who can, look stuff up on the internet, or they learn certain facts, and it's more of, you have to start prodding them a little bit more to see how they are and how they behave. And if they're more interested in the trappings of
trivia.
Oh, yeah, the trivia, and they don't really understand the context, right?
that it's if you have if you run across somebody who professes to be a Gorean master, for example, but has never read one of the books, he's about as convincing as somebody who purports to be a Star Trek fan but has never watched the show ever. And so they're not very convincing normally. But there's an awful lot of people in that subculture, don't you think, who have never read any of the books?
Right, and I think what appeals to a lot of people is what I brought up about the no limits, is if you find out that there's a group of submissive women who are out there that will do whatever you want them to do because they're not allowed to have any limits, then you're going to be drawn to that, as a dominant. And, we don't use dominant in Gore. It's master, mistress, or free person. Right. It's not, we don't use BDSM terms. In fact, if you try to equate BDSM with Gore, that's another thing that people are, if you say lifestyle with Gore, that's one thing that brings you out as a phony. Switch, there are no switches on Gore. Either, if you're a female, you're either a free woman or you're a slave.
Well, there are women slave holders in the novels. Not a whole lot of them, but there are.
Right, and that would be a free woman.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is true.
Right.
Now, what again, I'm pretty familiar with the Gorean subculture in the sense that I know a lot of people who are very much into it. And oh, by the way, Roxy, you might need to turn your volume down or mute your computer if you're around a computer, because we'll get a little bit of feedback there. But I do know a lot of people who are into the trappings of Gore and have been trained in Gore. And I've even had relationships with submissives who are Gorean trained, as you are. And so I'm pretty familiar with it, but I also understand that it has its limitations, and it does have a lot of assumptions that are sometimes just accepted without a whole lot of question. For example, when you said something like no limits, then Red will come right back to you and say, oh, so I can cut off your arm? You don't mind? You see what I'm saying? I mean, there's really no such thing as no limits, but
exactly,
and the illusion has to be maintained in order to fit that into your Gorean philosophy. There's an illusion, just like the illusion of consensual non-consent. There's really no such thing as consensual non-consent, but it's an illusion that we buy into just because it greases the skids for the relationship dynamic. So
exactly.
Now, but all that having been said, you mentioned that you yourself have been labeled a poser by members of the Gorean community. Why do you think that is?
Well, for one thing, everyone likes to out the other person as a poser, and one of the things right now, there is a way in the novels that is used as a punishment called slave speak, where you refer to yourself in third person. It puts you in your place, and it gives you, makes you mindful of the fact that you are a slave, where instead of saying I would say Roxana, thanks you, Master, for, and Roxana does thank you, Master, for allowing you on his show, and her show.
Thank her for me.
Well, and some people don't like that, and that is, in some cases, that's considered poser type behavior, because some people don't think that a person is actually in that mindset, that they're actually being kind of snarky, and if they start talking like Elmo is what I get, quit talking like Elmo.
That's
so
cute.
Yeah, but it is part of the books, but it's not used a lot. Mm-hmm. Another reason, right now I'm in a long-distance relationship, so I'm not doing this real life. So that's another thing. I guess that's the big thing with a Gorean. Have you done this real life? And I have. My very first BDSM relationship was.
Yeah.
Well, to me it's real life, but it's long distance.
Sure. It's kind of fuzzy. It's kind of interesting how people draw those dividing lines. I do believe that kind of the same way I believe about lifestyles being defined as affecting your life, I believe that real life is defined by affecting your life. And even if it is long distance,
yes,
if it affects your daily life in most aspects, then it's real. You just have to decide how real and how much it affects it. Anyway, we are running out of time, but we will definitely have you back, Roxy. I think you are a great guest, and you're very articulate about some of these topics, and so we're going to have you back as anytime we need a resident expert on gore, especially, or master-slave relationships. We'll have you back. So I hope you'll come back often.
Thank you, sir. I don't know if I consider myself an expert, but I have been doing it for over 30 years too. So
awesome. Well, we'll get you back on. Thanks for calling in.
Thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
All right, bye-bye. So, Red, I know that you're not a big fan of gore, but that was kind of interesting, wasn't it?
I would definitely be interested in learning more about how their protocols are and how they do things, because it is interesting to me, because the submissive side of me is very interested in the TPE, which seems to be the 24/7 what they're doing. I can't personally do it, but I'm interested in learning in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's got little tweaks going in my head going, maybe I need to go to Hastings now and pick up some books.
There you go. Now, we're going to spend the last couple of minutes, and we only have about 2 minutes to talk about this, but you wanted to touch on the effect of a poser or a phony on the local community, and tell us what you meant by that.
Well, if you have different little small groups within, a town, kind of like we did, and we do, one group can automatically affect another group. You have people who are coming into this, that are using this as an excuse for swinging and abuse and things like that. And it can actually be completely detrimental to the cores of the groups, because then it rocks the very foundation we stand on. And we need to be very careful on how one group's behavior affects another, because everybody will look at us the same, regardless if, you're out there wearing leathers and things like that.
Red, what do you do when you know that somebody is a phony? At what point do you feel that you are obligated to warn other people?
That very minute. If I have irrefutable proof that they are not what they're claiming to be, and they are going to be detrimental to my family and my friends, I will immediately oust you.
But what if you're wrong?
If I have irrefutable proof, that's when I go and say, hey, this is exactly what this is, and I'll lay the proof out there. And if I'm wrong, I'll take my punishment, and I will apologize profusely. But if I have that concrete, rock-solid evidence, I am not going to let you destroy my community, because one person can do that.
Absolutely. I agree with you there. I just have mixed feelings about causing that kind of drama and that those kind of rifts within a community. And so I have really, really mixed feelings about outing somebody that I think is a phony, because, I could be wrong. I'm, despite what everyone thinks.
Well, that's why I say, you have that rock-solid concrete evidence. Now, if I don't have that, I will sit back and I'll sit there and watch. And if somebody asks me my opinion, I'll go, if you want to play with them or you want to be friends with them, that's fine. I'm personally not going to. And if they ask me why, I will explain why I feel that way. But for me to go to our community, to go to everyone and go, this person is a phony, I'm going to sit there with my stack of evidence, just like you're going to court. I'm going to sit there with my stack of evidence that is irrefutable.
Well,
I can't lie your way through this.
The danger lies in what we were talking about at the beginning of the show. Just because somebody didn't meet your expectations doesn't mean they're a phony. Just because their dynamic, it doesn't match up with your dynamic, doesn't mean they're a phony. So I think there's a lot of pitfalls to be taken into consideration there, but we will probably save those for another show because we're running out of time. So I just want to thank everyone for listening this evening. You've been listening to Domination Submission Radio. My name is Mike Makai, the author of Domination Submission, the BDSM Relationship Handbook, and my co-host has been Little Red, a primal, switchy, masochist, Amazon redhead, crazy woman. And we thank you for listening. I hope you'll be back next week. Bye-bye now.